Thanks for asking me to come in. It's always one of the great things about living in Arcata is that there's a lot of interest in science and the environment, and that you all came out on a Friday night. Pretty impressive. So, a lot of people. What I'm going to be talking about is the McDaniel Slough restoration project, which most of it was completed last year. Actually, we're coming up on the 1-year anniversary. It was September 26th, a year ago, that we breached the levee and fully flooded the marsh. I work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Arcata, and I work for a program called the Conservation Partnerships Program. And the basis of this program is to provide assistance to local landowners and also to local agencies and municipalities to provide technical expertise and some small amount of financial assistance to do habitat restoration. My involvement with this project was to work with the City of Arcata and the State Department of Fish and Game, now the State Department of Fish and Wildlife, to develop the project and help out in some of the areas that they needed some additional assistance. What I'm going to be talking about tonight is where McDaniel Slough is located, something about what lands make up the project, and the partnerships that went into developing the project and doing the tidal restoration. We're going to be talking a little bit about the land use history of the plot of land where the project took place, and talk about the restoration goals for the project, what the project was hoping to achieve in terms of environmental restoration. And then I'm going to focus a lot on design of habitat features. You may not see them out there, but they are, and hopefully after I show you some of the things that we built, you'll have an appreciation for it. And then towards the end, we'll talk about where the marsh is now and how it's developing after the breaching last year. But the partnership was really pretty amazing. The two main players were the State Department of Fish and Game, which is now the State Department of Fish and Wildlife, and the City of Arcata. Primarily the two departments of the city were the Department of Public Works provided a lot of the engineering and fiscal bidding and items like that. And then Environmental Services provided a lot of the planning and permitting. A couple people to mention real quickly is Mark Andre headed the project with the Environmental Services. Julie Neander did a lot of the permitting. She did, it took much of her life, probably 10, 15 years to work on it. But there was also a variety of other people and agencies involved, and I can't begin to name them all. People that donated, provided financial assistance through the State Coastal Conservancy, NOAA, NRCS, some other agencies, and I won't be able to name them all. But we also had technical assistance from various people. Then, of course, the local contractors in the community, the Hoovens worked on this, SHN provided some geotechnical support. A lot of different groups worked on this, made it happen. So it was a great partnership. The Slough project area consists of really two components of land. One is a portion of land that belongs to the Arcata Marsh, and this is this area on the east side of McDaniel Slough, which runs up through the middle of the project area. And that was a parcel of land that, if I'll get in trouble on this, but I believe the city picked it up from the Hunt family in the mid-90s. And then there was some discussion about what to do with the parcel of land. On the other side this is all now fish and game land, and this is part of what's called the Mad River Slough Wildlife Area. And Mad River Slough is actually several miles to the west, but this came in. And during the course of the project, there were some parcels within the Mad River Slough Wildlife Area that were still being farmed by private landowners, but then those parcels were sold to the state, and so we were able to expand the footprint of the project. If you go to the marsh a lot, you'll note that the public pretty much has access to the Arcata Marsh side. The Fish and Game Wildlife Area has pretty restricted access due to their primary mission there is to provide habitat for birds, and they're also understaffed, so they don't have the public facilities yet. I want to take you back to what is our earliest good picture of what the Arcata Marsh and the bottoms and the north side of Humboldt Bay look like. This is a map from the Coast and Geodetic Survey prepared in the 1870s, and really this is our really best source of information of what was really there. But by 1870, European American settlers had been here for about 20 years, and they had already started farming the bottoms and clearing it out. They had not yet at that point got into this vast tidal marsh on the north side of the bay that basically extended all the way from Man River Slough around the corner at where the marsh is now, the Arcata Marsh, and then around down to Jacoby Creek. And you can see that within the marsh there are a lot of channels, little fine channels, and the mapping on this is really remarkable. That those channels are there, we still find them, and this serves as a guide for some of our restoration efforts. But just to locate yourself, this is the plaza here, this is the old wharf railroad, and this is now I Street. It comes in around the corner and then down, and the wharf used to go out into the bay. And McDaniel Slough is this channel here, and it's unique in the marsh in that it had a fairly large upland component draining from the higher uplands in the bottoms. A lot of you know it as James Creek. And James Creek originates back behind the industrial plazas in Giantoli, winds around, comes close to the Mad River, then winds around underneath 101, and then down the west side of Arcata. Originally, James Creek went out to Liscombe Slough, but at some point for the mills to provide a water supply, it was diverted and then fed into the top of McDaniel Slough. So now we call this, basically this creek, James Creek, and the tidal portion, McDaniel Slough. Taking a closer look, this is the area that I was describing, and this is pretty much where the project takes place. And to give yourself an orientation into present day, I've drawn in Samoa Boulevard where it's located. So this is, Samoa Boulevard at I Street. This is where it goes out, crosses the bridge at McDaniel Slough, and then heads out to the Mad River Slough. And then there's a B Street, and then this is the old Navy Base Road, or sometimes called Old Samoa Boulevard. You can see that where the marsh used to penetrate all the way up to where Samoa Boulevard is now, and then across it as you headed farther west. And the marsh also came pretty close, the town marsh also came into the area that is now the Arcata Marsh. During the 1870s and 80s, a lot of the land around the bottoms was cleared for farming, and people were looking for more land to farm. They turned their eyes to the tidal marshes, and this is from the Arcata Union describing the project that became the Bayfront Levee. What they did basically is they had a steam engine that would excavate material from a ditch and place it side-casted to make a levee. So they started at McDaniel Slough, came back towards the east, and tied in at I Street to make the first set of levees. Then they went from McDaniel Slough all the way west to Man River Slough, then hooked up into Liscombe Slough. Now, this work was done by a collection of landowners and investors, and under the federal rules at that time, there was actually a financial incentive to reclaim the marshlands for productive agriculture. So in addition to getting the land and fee title from the state, they were also paid per acre, something, I can't remember the number, but a certain dollar figure per acre to reclaim the land and convert it to agriculture. And this was reclamation. And this was how the tidal marsh was viewed. It was a wasteland, it wasn't a value. They didn't really see the productive value of it. And the really scary thing about this article is that this first levee construction in the Humboldt Bay area, and they say that it's going to be so special that all the lands between Arcata and Eureka and south of the place will be under cultivation. And it was very prophetic, because that's what happened. Most of the bay has levees of this nature that were placed there to make agriculture. Once they drained the salt marsh and the fresh water washed through with the rain, the land was very productive. It was very thick, organic, very little mineral content in that soil. They could till it and they could produce great crops because it was just all organic material. So a lot of it was converted into root crops, into hay fields, and then eventually pastures. This just shows you where the levee was built, and I think you'll recognize this is the bayfront. So there were some areas of tidal marsh that were excluded, and they're still out there. And that's kind of a reference point for us, that we have some tidal marsh that we know what it kind of looked like. If we advance a little bit, this is the same area. This is a 1948 aerial photo. And you can see that all that land that was tidal marsh now is now farmland. And the other thing I want you to note is the patchiness of the farmland. It's all laid out in different fields, small fields with fence lines running in between it. Some of it is in pasture, some of it is in row crops, some of it is in hay fields. But again, it's very small because the agriculture, the tools of the time were probably horse and plow and individuals. It wasn't really mechanized. As we advance into this is 1970, and you see that those small plots have started disappearing and they've been consolidated into larger plots. This area here, where most of McDaniel's, the city property, was run as a farm. I think the last group that held it was the Hunt family, and their descendants are still around, of course. But that was basically, a lot of it was dairy, and a lot of it was meat cattle. And I think there was like a butcher shop or butcher place in that barn. This is what it looked like in 2005, and this is right at the time that the city had gained title to the property. They had started the planning process to do the restoration project. But just to give you an idea of what it had started to look like. So we still have pasture lands here that were raised pretty close. This area over here is starting to look a little bit rough and thick vegetation. And you notice that as you get over to here that it's starting to look a little bit brown and not as green. And the reason for that is the land over on the west side was subsiding quicker than a lot of the other land. The reason the land subsides is because it was all that organic material. And when it gets exposed to air and the salt is taken away, it starts to decay. So it physically starts to disappear. So that ground started to sink, and it used to be up at an elevation that was 7 or 8 feet above mean low water. And by the time that they got to, we started working on the project, this land had subsided down to 4 or 5 feet. So it lost 2 or 3 feet of surface material. And that'll come into play later on when we talk about some of the restoration. I'm a little hazy on this. I've heard people talk about the planning process for this, but the city, working with its various committees, came up with the idea to do a restoration. And the goal of the restoration, very simply, was to restore and enhance coastal and riparian wetland habitats on the north side of Humboldt Bay. They wanted this to be a self-sustaining tidal marsh, as free from constraints to develop naturally as possible. Why was this an important goal? From my perspective as environmentalist working with habitat restoration, the value of tidal marshes, salt marshes, is just so valuable for primary productivity. We start with the salt grass, and then that starts the whole food web for a wide complex of animals, plants, and just critters of all type. So we support the fishes, we support the crabs, we support the shrimp, the floating animals in the water column, and that all goes into feeding up all the way to the top to the salmon. And of course, if we were looking at that, we see humans up there eating the salmon. So really, it supports our food chain. Tidal marshes are among the most productive land in the entire world. The only thing that exceeds it is mangrove swamps. And the reason is because we have this exchange of tidal water going back and forth each day that circulates nutrients, water, and food. And then we have a very shallow surface that gets heated by the sun, so we have a lot of energy feeding in with nutrients, and it produces the tidal marsh, which produces a lot of vegetation. Other issues that were important in doing this restoration is to improve the water quality, discharging, because behind the levees, the water gets stagnant and kind of sits there and gets anoxic. There's also a goal here was to reduce the flood risk to the James Creek watershed, because as time developed, the channel was filling in with debris and sediment, and it was becoming difficult, and floods were becoming more and more frequent in upstream in James Creek. Getting back to this idea of tidal marshes, this is our understanding based on that 1870 map of where tidal marshes were located in Humboldt Bay before the Americans and the Europeans came in and started clearing and draining. If we look at 2005, we're now down to these areas of yellow. So that represents a 90 to 95% loss in the tidal marsh habitat. Now go back to that idea that if all that marshland is providing the basis for the food web that's producing the fish in the bay, producing the salmon, producing the birds, we take away 95% of that, what's going to happen to the fish populations? They're going to go down. You can see that restoring tidal marshes is a good idea to try to help with our salmon recovery and just help with our general fisheries. Another thing to think about with tidal marshes is they're an important place in the landscape. I like to think of it as the transition between the fluvial processes of rivers and streams in the uplands and the ocean processes generated by tides. Now, it's important to have this transition area where things can mix between the fluvial, the fish that move in and out of the near estuary, and the fish that come out of the ocean that move into the estuary to seek food. We also have nutrient exchange and a lot of chemical processes that take place that are very important to sustaining a healthy ecology. The other thing that's important is think about sea level rise. If we have a fixed barrier at the location between where we have rivers and oceans, eventually that barrier is going to be overtopped, and we have no accommodation space to make that adjustment. So by restoring these tidal marshes, we have an area that can adjust to sea level rise as it occurs. Another important aspect is fish barriers. This is the levee structure, or the levee gates at the end of McDaniel Slough that were installed in 1970. Prior to that, there was a smaller structure that didn't allow much exchange, but I think it did allow some fish passing. There are reports of coho salmon being in James Creek up until the mid-70s, and I think the last report is in the early 80s. And after that, there was no coho salmon seen because they couldn't migrate through these culverts, especially with the flap gates. And this is showing towards the end of its life cycle, these tide gates were falling off, and that was a big problem during construction. We had to keep on patching them to keep them alive until we were done. The planning process started in the mid-90s, and at one point the city hired the firm of Philip Williams and Associates to do a preliminary design. Phil Williams and Associates had done much of the first work in restoring tidal marshes in the San Francisco Bay Area. They established a lot of principles, a very clever group of people. Phil Williams himself is just a great innovator in doing tidal marsh restoration. So they developed the plan, and it was composed of several different elements that we'll talk about. There was a setback levee. There was a levee breach that would then allow water to flow in here. There would be a series of ponds that would serve a couple purposes that I'll talk about. And the levees would extend over onto the fish and game side, the setback levee, and this area would be flooded. That was the plan that was put through the permitting process, and the basic elements stayed. That's what we ended up with. There was a lot of filling in the colors around the edges around the preliminary design that I've been involved with for the last 8 years to make the design happen. Really the big accomplishment was to get an EIR out, environmental impact. That was an interesting process. I wasn't here at the time, but I know that there was a lot of discussion in the community about what this project should be. There was a lot of questions, well, were salt marshes of any value? Would a bike trail be better? Would freshwater marshes be better? And I think that was really, really good for the community to have the chance to have that input and have their say. And the plan, I think, was modified, and there's elements that were included as a result of that. But that's a huge document. That's about this thick. That included the proposed project and description. There's also a variety of permits that we had to get from the Corps of Engineers. This is one that we were modifying to modify the project a little bit, but that's also another stack of documents. There's another set of documents that have to go in to get the clean water certification. So what I'm telling you here is that there is a lot of work, and there's a stack of paper here that Julie Neander had to take care of to make this happen, and that's an impressive task. I'm not going to talk about that. What I do want to talk about is how things were designed, and I'll talk about the levees, some ponds and wetlands, how we were trying to reestablish hydraulic connections so fish and animals, how we worked with the marsh plain to try to recover it and vegetation. We had some issues with infrastructure, notably the PG E towers that cross the project area, and then we'll look at the breaching. So setback levees are basically to prevent coastal flooding. We have high tides that will come in, The design right now will allow for, it's designed to be 3 feet above the highest expected tide that we're having now. So there was some allowance in here for future sea level rise. And basically, Levee is just a pile of dirt with a 10-foot wide on top and then 2.5 to 1 side slopes. We also, in some of the areas, we have what's called an eco-levee. This is kind of steep, and so as the water comes up, the transition is pretty quick between wet areas and dry areas. The idea of the eco-levee was to create an area where tidal marsh could develop along the toes, and the transition would be much slower. They work great, except that they eat a lot of dirt. And as we'll find out, dirt becomes an issue. This is how the area looked in 2005 again. And the first set of levees that were built were to make what we call a brackish pond, and I'll describe that in a few seconds. And to make sort of the north end of the levee on the marsh side. Our next set of levee construction a couple years later was on the west side to make the north end. And then it took us several years to get the west side levee done on the fish and game land. And that's a long story that I won't go into. And then last year we had, finally finished all the levees up on the north end and closed it up. So at this point, we have a levee protection all the way around the project area. And then there's a series of gates, pipes with flat gates on it that allow water to come into the project area, but prevent the salt water from going further back. Levee construction, it was the hardest element of the whole project. I mean, moving that much dirt, it all has to be compacted to make it firm enough to withstand flooding, and so we don't have a levee failure in the future. It took a lot of big equipment, moved a lot of dirt. That's really one of the big design tricks for constructing a project of this nature. Where do you get the dirt to build a levee of this size? The trade-off was that we used borrow areas that we then converted to habitat features. So we had freshwater ponds, brackish ponds, wetland improvements over on the fish and game property. We also borrowed dirt from internal levees along McDaniel Slough inside the project area. And then we had some city projects over on Jacoby Creek that we borrowed dirt from there to bring over to here. This is the brackish pond, and I'll talk about each of these in detail, but this is an area that's exposed to both fresh and salt. We also have some freshwater ponds outside the levee area. Within the project area, we have what I call a salt pond that's a permanently flooded shallow pool. And over on the fish and game side, we have a seasonal wetland. This is a wetland that is flooded during the winter and is dry during the summer. And then at the bottom end of the fish and game property, we have what's called a brackish pond, or brackish wetland. It's a shallow wetland that's exposed to salt water. This is a picture of some of the freshwater ponds, and as you can see, these are very deep. They go down to 7 feet. These are fed by spring water. And in the 5 years since I think they've been constructed, they've stayed pretty flooded. Even this year, they've only lost like maybe a foot of water in, and it's staying pretty wet. There was some planting done, but a lot of the vegetation came in naturally, and of course the birds love it, and it's proven to be, I imagine there's some birders here who can tell me more about that than I'll let you tell me. This is the brackish pond. This is the one immediately adjacent to I Street, and you can see that within this we have some islands to create some protected habitat. This is flooded. This is about 2 to 3 feet in depth. We're still working through some details with this, but this is the control gate for the brackish pond. And the way it's designed is that we have a flat gate that has a hinged gate on it that allows water to flow into the pond. And then this device on the inside of the pond is actually a float. And so when the water level rises, the float rises and then closes this gate. So, and right now we have it in a very limited range, but I think over the next year we'll be starting to increase the range of variance in the pond, and we'll see on a daily tidal cycle a little bit more flushing. But the pond will always be flooded. This is the salt pond in the middle of the project area, and this is just a shallow area that's permanently flooded. This provides habitat for tidewater goby, which is an endangered species. This is a small fish that's about this big, lives in brackish areas. It's not a very strong swimmer, so it can't live in an area where the water is constantly moving around. It'll be flushed out. So it likes to live in shallow areas, and we hope that that will provide habitat for it. And again, egrets love this. You'll always see the egrets over on the west side. They like fish. This is the seasonal wetland over on the Fish and Game. This is outside the levee. And you can see that it's basically during the summertime, it's allowed to go to grass. And then during the wintertime, it'll be flooded up to, again, a shallow depth. And this provides seasonal winter habitat for the birds that migrate through the area, and that's one of Fish and Game's primary objectives in managing that land. This is a brackish wetland that's on the lower end of the project, and this is connected through a couple of channels that tie into that bayfront levee ditch. Bayfront levee ditch is salt, and it allows a small spillover into this area, and then during the wintertime we also have fresh water coming in from the top. So this is a mixing zone. So right now it's probably pretty salty because there hasn't been any fresh water except after last night. I mean, there's some rain in there. But again, it creates a shallow area for a lot of small insects and bugs, and I'm not a biologist, so I'll get those wrong, but basically a lot of life can live in there, and you can see that the birds are in there foraging. So it provides habitat for them. This is, again, we're starting to see the picture of all these improvements. What I wanted to point out now is talk about some of the internal levees that we took out, and I'm not sure how well you can see this and make it flash for you, but there was a duck pond that one of the ranchers had developed here and made to fill this up, and then this would be a flooded basin during the winter. And I've heard from many people who said, oh yeah, I used to hunt out there. There was also, alongside McDaniel Slough, there was a levee to keep floodwaters from James Creek off these ranch lands. We took these out in various locations to allow water to spread out across the marsh plain. And we have some small breaks up here and another break up there. That also provided us some dirt to use in levees. That doesn't look like much. These are just small levees, and what we're doing here is just an excavator is just taking the levee and dragging it and putting the dirt back to where it was originally dug out of a channel. So there's like little borrow channels right next to the levees where the dirt came from originally. And all we did was just pull the dirt back and fill those channels. Reestablishing hydraulic connectivity was an important issue. Probably more on the Arcata Marsh side than on the Fish and Game side. One of the things that happens with the levee construction is you have this bayfront levee that's the borrow to make the levee, and that basically, so there's a ditch that runs along the inside of the levee, all the way along the levee, all the way to the Mad River Slough. If you don't do anything with those after you flood it, they just stay there. They're too big to get filled in. The Tidal network won't redevelop. Part of this project, what we did was that we eventually blocked the channel here to block this levee ditch. And then we dug a new channel up here, and we tied it into existing drainage ways that were there prior to the land being ranched. And they're still there. The water will now come in through here, through this channel, it'll flood up through here, and then flood back through here, and then back up through here to the brackish pond. So we get a lot of mixing, and we get a very complex pattern of flow movement. We also did dug a couple channels up near the top to provide some diversity, and we also had some breaks to bring flow into these areas. On the west side, as I was telling you, the channel networks are pretty strong and pretty much in their original shape. You can see that they're there, and we didn't really feel the need to do much improvements on those. This gives you some idea of the scale of this slough. This is the east side tidal slough, and this was dug down to about starting at about mean level water. It's about 20 feet wide, and it starts out very big, but then as it moves up, it gets smaller and smaller, replicating what an original channel would have looked like. This is after the breach, but these are the flooded side connections allowing water to get through the levee and then into channels that then drain into our salt pond. I'm going to spend a few minutes to talk about the marsh plain restoration. We've done a lot with ponds and channels. But we also have to be concerned with what the marsh plain looks like. This is a diagram that kind of gives you a schematic of how elevation controls what types of plants occur in the tidal environment. When the water is really deep, you don't get any plants. It's not until you start shallowing out and you get up to about mean-high water, high water, that you start to see salt marsh vegetation develop. Below that, if the water is too deep, so the plants cannot colonize this area because they're underwater too often and they suffocate, or they have to deal with too much salt. If you can reduce the amount of water or reduce the amount of salt, they can extend further. But since our water is very salty, we're limited to up here. Then there's a certain amount of plants that can take a lot of water, but the really diverse plants start to occur in the high marsh, way up at the end of the range of tidal flooding. This is a diagram that sort of maps out how much inundation the various plants we have in our native plants in our marshes can take. So what this is indicating is that a lot of these plants can only be inundated about 2 to 6% of the time. Meaning during the course of a day, they only want to be inundated like half an hour, just right up at the fringe of the tidal range. We have two plants that do very well in deeper water. The biggest one is called, the common name is pickleweed. It's now known as California or Sarcocornia. That does very well and can be inundated up to 20% of the time. That's the one that you'll see out on the fringes of the tidal marsh. Then we have a second plant that's not a native. It's Spartina. It does very well in that it can withstand a lot more inundation than a lot of our native plants, and it can get out on the fringes of the marsh. And that's its big advantage. It can get up and start shading out the pickleweed and then establish very big fringe marshes that then can move in. And that's why it's an invasive plant. It has an advantage over all the other local plants. If we're trying to make a healthy tidal marsh, you want to start looking for elevations that will support these plants rather than one that will just support Spartina. So think of this, this is just a different way of seeing that same type of data. What I'm showing you is the percent of time flooded and the elevation reference to mean low water. About 100% of the time, you're always going to have much of the bay flooded. But then as we start getting into the shallower areas, it'll become less and less flooded. And so we get to this point about 5.5 feet above mean low water. That's where we start to see pickleweed. And then we get to about 6 to 7, that's where we start to see the Spartina. If we made our tidal flat in that area, or our tidal marsh in that area, we'd end up with Spartina. What we really want is that sweet spot at the upper end, which is where we're going to get all those great diversity of plants. What does this all mean? So remember, this is kind of what those pastures look like after we put in the levee and drained out the tidal marsh. We have the marsh. It's now grasslands protected from salt water. But the subsidence occurs, and some of it is from cattle trampling, but more is just the organic decay of the soil. So that land sinks, and we'll start losing some cows. Over time, what happens is that that land becomes less and less productive, and that's what happened to a lot of the farmland. It just became, the farmers couldn't make it work because it was just getting too low and too salty and too wet. If we take away our cows and then take away the levee and let the marsh flood, what we're going to find is that our salt marsh is going to restore out to only a portion of what was there originally. The original extent was probably out to here. So we've lost this amount just because the ground's gotten lower. There's various ways to deal with that. Remember, dirt is an issue. We don't have a lot of dirt. We weren't able to deal with that by just filling. But one of the things that Phil Williams worked on was how long it would take for just natural deposition to occur. And as deposition occurs, the marsh can then expand back to its old range. And their calculations were that it would be about 40 to 50 years for enough sediment to come into that marsh area to fully bring it back to what its original condition was. When we had opportunities, we did put dirt out on the marsh plain to try to raise it up. And remember that channel that I showed you that we were constructing? We took the dirt from that channel and spread it out on the marsh plain and raised it up in areas that were particularly low. One of the last issues I wanted to talk about was PG E. This was problematic during the course of the design work because we never really got good information or commitments. But there's a series of 4 towers that cross the marsh area. And finally, the word from PG E was that they wanted to have the ability to access the towers during emergencies. So we had to build a series of access pads, and I think some of you that are familiar with Marsh will have seen that the 2 towers on the Arcata side, you'll have dirt pads that go out to them. And this is construction of one of those pads. On the west side, we had a tower that was like right next to McDaniel Slough that was way into the marsh. So what we had to do was to build a gravel road out to the tower, and then the gravel is at an elevation that gets flooded by high tides. So they'll still be able to get out to there by driving through shallow water, but we still allow the water to flow over it. Once we got everything done, the next step was to breach the levee, the final really big construction action. To give you, this is the pictures that Dave Kenworthy took for us, but this is the mouth of McDaniel Slough. This is the bay where the bay channel comes in and goes through the levee gates. And this is McDaniel Slough up there. This is the bayfront levee ditch, and you can see that we blocked this one off, and this one is open. Really what we had to do over the course of days was we had to shave it down, shave it up, and until we got it narrow enough and just right down to the level of the high tide. So then in one quick night we could go out and take out all the pipes and take out the levee. This is the last shovelful of dirt to breach the levee being pulled out. And there it gets pulled, and now the bay is coming into the slough. This is the next morning, the Humboldt Bay out there, and now the water is flowing into McDaniel Slough. So that was a fun time, and that was a year ago next Friday. This is what the project looks like at a moderate flood. This is from Samoa Boulevard looking to the south over the bay. So you can see that we have that tidal pond over here. We have some of the wetland areas over on the fish and game land. Big area of flooding on the fish and game side. Here's actually the salt pond. Here's McDaniel Slough winding its way through, and there's the freshwater ponds over on the left. Now again, note that the west side, the fish and game side, is lower, so the water is flooding there at greater depths. So that's more likely to convert to mudflat over time until we get enough sediment coming in to fill back in. This is another shot taken in the spring, and what I wanted to show you with this shot is that we had that burst of rainfall, I think, in February and March. I think this is an April or May shot. You can see the bottom is all greening up, but our marsh is looking kind of brown and depressed because all the plants that have been adapted to salt or freshwater are now getting hit by salt water. The point of doing this work is that we want to monitor what would happen over time. So we are doing a lot of monitoring, and various people are involved with this. Probably the best story is the fish monitoring. Remember I told you about the coho disappeared from Salmon Creek, or from James Creek? This spring in January, upstream of Samoa Boulevard, the city had hired Fish and Game to do some fish sampling. They started finding coho. This is a year plus coho, meaning that it was born in the spring of 2013, lived a year in freshwater up in the upper reaches, probably of Jacoby Creek. And then during the winter storms, they start moving down towards the bay to forage and find food. At some point, it's likely came out of Jacoby Creek, went through the bay, and then went up McDaniel Slough and into the upper reaches of James Creek, where it found creek that it could live in, freshwater and gain weight. They started finding a bunch of coho later in the season. And so at some point, the coho during the late spring will leave and go out to the bay and smolt. So that was a great story. This is my photo, which I have to take credit for because you can't see anything. But if you look closely, you'll see that the water has a lot of ripples on it. This is a picture I took just the other day at low tide. And this is in an area of the marsh that's permanently flooded with water at low tide. There's about a foot or two of water in there. And at low tide, the fish concentrate. And what we're seeing there is, I believe, a smelt that is just booming. Now, before we did the restoration, the smelt would have been restricted to those big tidal channels in the bay, and every day the bay fills up and then empties out. So those fish would have been moving back and forth without any place to hang out and grow. Now that we have the marsh, they're in this marsh and they're flourishing. We've seen this in McDaniel's, we've also seen it in our Jacoby Creek project, and also down at the Humboldt Bay National Wildlife Refuge where we've done some restoration. That has great potential, I think, for fisheries in the future. That's really exciting. Freshwater vegetation is going to die off. The vegetation actually is recovering, so what you're starting to see here is this is some of the pickleweed coming in, but you see that where there's enough gradient, you'll see that some of that grass is still holding on because it doesn't get flooded very often. But there's other vegetation starting to come in. And the city is working with Andrea Picard and Annie Eicher to do vegetation transects to map the change. So far, the preliminary results are showing us that we're going to have more vegetation than we thought we would. We're going to have less mudflat than we thought we would. And we think that that's because the mouth of McDaniel Slough is still doing a little bit of restriction on the flow moving in and out, so we're not getting as much inundation as we thought we would. Over on the west side, it's a little bit different. Remember, that's lower. We do have high clumps of grass that are hanging on, but a lot of this is going to be shallowly flooded land. And that's not necessarily bad. You can see that the egrets love it. Someone anticipated that, showing you a picture. But there's also on here, there's a bunch of little peeps hanging out on an island. They got some habitat protection from predators during the tides. So it is providing, the vegetation will come back slowly, but it's still providing habitat now. Water quality is something we've been looking at, and I just wanted to share this one with you. This is, these blue lines going up and down, if you can see them at all, those are the tides. And this black line represents the salinity that we measured in the James Creek channel 100 feet upstream of Samoa Boulevard. So before the breaching, the salinity was essentially zero, fresh water. And then we removed the tide gates, we got a little jump in salinity. Then the tide started going into a neap cycle, we weren't pushing water as far, it started becoming fresh. But then we started getting into a high tide, a spring tide cycle, and we started pushing salinity farther and farther up. So then a neap cycle goes back down, high tide goes back up, and starts to approach bay salinity levels. That's kind of what we expected to have happen. To show you the effects of what that means, this is a picture taken in 2009 from the Samoa Creek, the Samoa Bridge. And you're looking down at McDaniel Slough, and this is one of the flood issues. The channel is filled with this grass here. It's called reed canary grass. And this is an invasive grass that can expand into the channel and basically block the channel off. It just plugs the channel up with, and it's a very dense monoculture. It's not very good habitat. When you start hitting it with a year of salt, this is what it looks like now. That reed canary grass got killed off while the cattails die off. Unfortunately, we're going to lose these willows. You can see that they don't have any leaves on them. They should be fully leaved, but they're dying as well because their feet are in the salt. If we look upstream of Samoa Boulevard, we'll also see that there's a willow die-off, and that's extending up into the reach behind Billow Way. And we are seeing salt water get up to towards Billow Way, which was actually former tidal slough. The channel behind Billow Way is occupied by reed canary grass, and we're hoping the salinity knocks that back. The city does have an ongoing project with the service to remove reed canary grass, and that's, some of you may have seen those projects throughout James Creek. Something else that will happen over time is that the tidal channels will erode and reestablish their original dimensions. This is the entrance channel at low tide. This is a shot I took in 2009. And notice that we've got a narrow channel here at low tide, small channel here, hardly any drainage back there. This is a couple days ago. The entrance channel has gotten much larger. This bank has eroded out. This channel up here is deepened. It's now holding a lot more water. So that's the natural outcome. We expect that erosion to occur, and a lot of that material that's being eroded is being washed out and then gets washed back in and deposited on the marsh plain. Around the channels on the marsh plain, you start to see a lot of sediment, good inch or two. We're also seeing the channel enlarge, moving to the west because there's a lot of water moving through that bayfront levee ditch to flood that area to the west. And this is actually the old structure from the 40s that we left in place, but there's been enough erosion now that it's eroded behind it and sort of fallen in. But that'll continue to erode, and we kind of expect that to happen. That's why we placed the rock barriers at the mouth to prevent people from getting too close if the channel sloughs in.
I have a question.
Sure.
There's a great diversity of kinds of water there. Would you repeat what the long-term plan is? Is the plan to return it all to saltwater marsh, or will it be maintained?
We have, within this levee structure, this is all allowed, that's completely allowed to go to nature and be controlled by the tides. So that extends, all the way over to the west side. This is where fresh water comes in, and that's natural. There is a control structure here to flood that up if they want to, or to drain it out, because one of the problems with wetlands and birds during the winter, if you get too many birds, you can get cholera and get an outbreak and kill off the birds. So they have to have the ability to drain that. There is a tide gate here that restricts the flow coming in here, but there's a small pulse to go through there. And this brackish pond is managed. Well, they're not natural, but they are operating in a natural sense. They're being flooded by spring water and rainwater, and they're doing their own thing.
Will they fill in then?
Yeah, there's not a sediment source for those to fill them in. There's a limited drainage area. There's nothing bringing sediment in, and the water's deep enough that the organics won't build up on the bottom. So those should stay open for a while. Now, the question is, what's natural? This is a managed system. So we try to find the balance where we can make it as wild as possible within the limits of protecting infrastructure and property. Obviously, we don't want to be flooding Samoa Boulevard on a regular basis. We did accomplish a lot with this. The original idea was to get about 240 acres of restoration. I think we ended up doing about 360 when we added fish and game land and their wetland improvements. When we operate around the bay, we are dealing with managed systems, but we have to try to make them as natural as possible to let natural processes control how they develop.
I'm curious, why did you breach at night?
It was the best tide. We wanted to get a low tide, and during so we could get, the bottom of the channel would be exposed so we could pull the dirt out. So we started at a high tide, which in September starts at about 10 o'clock, and during a spring tide, during the highest tide range, and then it dropped through the night down to a very low tide of -1. Just the timing of the tides around this time of the year that they occur at night.
You started off at the top, the discussion with the amount of bay land or tidal land that had been reclaimed.
Right.
Which 95%. What percentage of the original land would this project represent?
I've worked that number out one time. It's significant. But I'm not sure of the number.
I was wondering because this project took about 30 years to happen, and so I'm just trying to
Yeah.
the point of where might we be if these kinds of projects continue, or how long, what might be the whole.
Yeah, I don't think we'll ever get all the way back because obviously there's still a lot of working lands around the bay, and a lot of what we try to do is to do projects that accommodate the continuing use of the land by farmers, but also try to improve the habitat. The Jacoby Creek in the Baylands area is an example of that. We've done some opening up of channels, but the uplands that it's been muted and controlled so they can continue to graze. So it's a balance. You have to balance the needs of the environment versus the landowner needs and perceptions. So, and then we're also the big projects that are going on now is that we've done this one. The Baylands project has done a lot. There'll be some more work done at Baylands. There's been a lot of work being done down at the Humboldt Bay National Wildlife Refuge to restore Tidal Marsh. And there's a couple projects in the mid-Bay area, upriver and so on, that are being under development.
Where's Bayland?
Baylands is the parcel of land that extends, it's on the east side of 101, and extends from the interchange at Samoa Boulevard down to Bayside Cutoff, and up to Old, basically up to Old Arcata Road. There's a fringe of houses along Old Arcata Road, but behind there is, that's the Baylands project area. And that's currently, it's mixed use between restoration and ranching. For the final design of the levees, it was, they're high enough to withstand a couple of feet of sea level rise. But I don't think it was, when the project was being planned, I don't think the perception was there. Certainly there's a lot more resiliency now that we have tidal marsh back to allow that accommodation space to change over time. But there are a lot of areas around the bay that are at risk for sea level rise. And there are several projects going on right now, notably the Harbor District and Coastal Conservancy are funding projects to investigate how to accommodate the sea level rise. And Alderon Laird is involved in one of those projects. So he does a lot of presentations from time to time there.
Yeah.
A lot of valuable information.
So is there any projection of this moving west along the top part of the bay, south of the old small boulevard?
And Fish and Game actually owns quite a bit of the land that they manage for hunting.
Right.
And I throw this out, Fish and Game is doing they have a really tough job. Their budgets are been cut significantly. The land manager out there, Charles Bartolotta, does a great job with the resources he has, but he's very underfunded and understaffed, so it's very, he does what he can to make things happen, but it's a hard job. He's also responsible for the Bay Slough and also for some of the fishing game lands up in Del Norte. There used to be a mill, I think it's like around where Alliance comes into James Creek. I think there was a mill there. I may have my location a little bit off, but I think that's where it was diverted to bring water to the mill, and then they discharged it to the south.
And also, James Creek goes into McDaniel Slough.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, so again, it's a little bit confusing because when we speak of the tidal portion of James Creek, we call it McDaniel Slough.
So that's about Samoa.
Yeah.
Or further up now.
Yeah.
Okay, I got you.
Aside from the goby and the saltwater pond and the coho salmon, are there any animal species that you're kind of targeting for a comeback to the restoration plan here?
I know
this used to be like the northern end of the Clapper Rails range here, but the wetland destruction kind of wiped them out towards the San Francisco Bay.
I haven't heard that.
Okay.
And no, I don't think that came up. Maybe some of the bird people I talked about, but I may have missed out.
I did find a starry flounder in Brackish Wetland.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's about that big.
No fish. I think there was some question back there.
You showed the cattle farm areas subsiding over time with use. I'm curious if you've seen the existing levee system subside and sending that existing levee system as well.
I think so. So this gets into an interesting history. So remember, there was a consortium of investors that created the levee district, and there is special legislation under California law to make these levee districts. This was done back from the 1860s, and they did create a levee district that manages and owns the levee itself. And this is the current ownership of the levee district has devolved to the landowners adjacent to that are protected presumably by the levees. And so there is a board of local farmers and ranchers, and strangely enough, now it's also Department of Fish and Game, the City of Arcata, and Humboldt State, because they own land within the levee district area. So the whole point of that is that, they were responsible for maintaining the levees, and they were able to get a grant several years ago to, after Katrina, to do a major restoration. So they did bulk up their levees to their original height, and they do subside. Because you're basically on you know, between earthquakes and just compaction, they sink. I also work with the refuge staff down in Levee, and that's got a bunch of.
I was just thinking about when you were talking about this being a managed system, that probably in all the world you can find a better model than the Arcata Marsh as far as that and in terms of the interface with the public and the process. I was just thinking that must have been really interesting, this kind of new generation taking place, even while the people who were there for the construction of the marsh itself still being around to offer input. And that just must have been a really fascinating process.
Yeah, well, that goes back to the, I think it says a lot for the community. I talked about the partnership at the beginning. There was a lot of people involved in this project. They were all excited about it. You know, it's interesting getting the input. I think the Brackish Pond wouldn't have happened unless there was input from the community. So we'll see how that turns out. The idea of doing wetlands, I think, came from the community, especially the birding community. So, yeah, you know, it was important, I think, for this project, and you know, certainly for Arcata. You know, there are a lot of people active in the community, so it really does make a difference.
Would you say a lot of the data came from studies, research, things that associated with the Marsh project, or not necessarily?
Not necessarily. You know, a lot of the guidance that we got for this, a lot of the concepts that we got for this project did originate in the San Francisco Bay Area, particularly the marshes in the north side, which tend to be a little bit more shallow. There are some significant differences there, though. They have a huge sediment supply, and you know, they're able to restore the marsh plains by accretion very quickly. We don't have anything like that sediment supply.
There, you mentioned the occurrence of Spartina dense flora, and I'm wondering whether there are going to be any attempts to prevent it from coming into your restored marsh areas. As you are aware, I'm sure, there's some sentiment in the Fish and Wildlife Service that they want to try and eradicate Spartina from the bay.
Well, we did make an attempt to eradicate. There were areas of Spartina within the marsh area, and there was an attempt to eradicate the existing plants over a couple of years. And that had mixed success because it was just difficult conditions to, they tried to dig up all the plants, and then they found out they couldn't haul them out. So they ended up leaving huge bundles to biodegrade under plastic. But there was an attempt to control it. That's also why we're looking at the vegetation surveys that are taking place to see if that becomes a problem. Generally, I think what we've seen is that in Spartina is not an active first colonizer, and they settled the back end of the salt flooding and the front end of the salt flooding, and then started moving in. So it's slower, but in the long run it will take over. So as far as the eradication or control that, there is the Harbor District is working on a long-term plan to do Spartina control throughout the Humboldt Bay area. U.S. Fish and Wildlife has a long-term project to eradicate Spartina densiflora from the refuge lands within the bay. And that's why you see all the guys with weed whackers out on the refuge properties trying to eliminate the return of Spartina. So, you know what, as far as I understand, what they have is basically a heavy-duty weed whacker that they really have to grind down the root mass.
I got you.